And we have breaking news now. A federal judge is temporarily blocking President Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship. The New Hampshire judge says he will certify a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the children affected by President Trump's EO and issue a preliminary injunction blocking it. You might remember just last month, the Supreme Court allowed President Trump to move forward on that executive order and limited the authority of federal judges to block the order without a class action. Let's bring in ABC News D.C. Bureau Managing Editor, along with ABC News contributor and legal analyst James Sample. So, Catherine, walk me through the details of this judge's order and what the judge is saying here.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. There was a hearing in New Hampshire, about an hour-long hearing in New Hampshire, where the judge went over his order here. And what this is doing is blocking the Trump administration's executive order that was issued, of course, on February 20th. So that is when anybody who was born in the United States after that executive order was signed. So that's who this applies to. So it's important to point out that this lawsuit was filed in New Hampshire last month. It was brought on behalf of pregnant immigrants, 2 immigrant parents and their infants. Now, you just mentioned that it does come after the Supreme Court's order, a ruling, if you will, on the nationwide injunctions. Of course, this ruling comes from a federal judge in New Hampshire, but it does come after the Supreme Court's order. Now, what's interesting here is that the Supreme Court's order did leave the door open for challenges to seek relief by filing class action lawsuits. And that's what we are looking at here. So while the court did generally block this practice of nationwide injunctions, it did have those specific carve-outs. This is not a nationwide injunction. So these class action suits that you're seeing today essentially will achieve that same effect. It will be interesting to see, of course, how this plays out through the courts, through the appeals courts, and how the appeals courts interpret the Supreme Court's ruling as it relates to this. But right now, of course, the judge is issuing this block on this executive order from going into effect for certain classes of people.
So, James, what happens from here? Because the judge says that he is going to certify this class action, and the Supreme Court in their ruling did say, you know, the way to get a large nationwide type injunction is this way. So what are the next steps?
Well, the judge stayed the order for a period of 7 days, which is essentially giving the government time to appeal. An appeal in this case would go to the First Circuit, the Federal Court of Appeals that's primarily based in Boston. And then if it were to be appealed from there to the Supreme Court on an express track, presumably. But you're right that the Supreme Court's ruling did leave this door open, Diane, for a class action. It is an additional hurdle that plaintiffs and parties challenging government actions have to go through. And we often hear the term thrown around, class action. What does it actually mean in practice? Well, it means that there are four basic requirements of a class action. Numerosity, there need to be numerous people. That certainly applies here. Typicality, the claims of the representative party are typical of all of the absentee class members. So here, an unborn child or a child of an undocumented immigrant, their situation is typical of those absentees who would be in that same circumstance. Commonality, they have common questions of law or fact. The common question here couldn't be plainer. Is the executive order to change the meaning of the 14th Amendment constitutional or not constitutional? And then finally, adequacy. Are the named class members going to adequately represent the interests of all of the class members? The judge in this case, a George W. Bush appointee, Joseph LaPlante, said yes. That is the mechanism at this point, based on last month's ruling, to challenge something on a nationwide basis.
Catherine, what happens next now?
Well, look, I think it's exactly what we just laid out here. This is obviously, there's a 7-day period where the Trump administration can challenge this. Surely they will say that the executive order is constitutional, and this will make its way through the courts. It will be interesting, of course, to see what the appeals court says. I believe the Supreme Court ruling doesn't go into effect until the end of July. But the reality is here that with the Supreme Court ruling, we are entering an entirely different legal landscape. We haven't really seen the effects of that yet. So this is an interesting challenge to observe, especially as it works its way through the appeals court. Of course, as we've discussed, there's that 7-day period for the Trump administration to appeal, which I'm sure they will.
All right, Catherine Falders, James Sample, thank you both.